Hi kids, this video is the notes that we went over today in our Zoom meeting. So this video is for those who weren't able to make it in the Zoom meeting today, or if you were in the Zoom meeting and you just need to go back and review any part of it. Okay, so we're going to talk about selective breeding and pedigrees, and we're going to talk about the difference between a pedigree and a Punnett square. Selective breeding is also known as artificial selection. In the 8th grade, you'll actually talk about natural selection, and that's where nature takes its course. You know, the way that organisms multiply naturally. And we're going to talk about what the difference between natural selection and artificial selection is. But first, we're going to review Punnett squares and get a little bit of background information before we move on to talking about artificial selection and pedigrees. The first, I want you to remember a Punnett square is a chart that predicts the outcome of offspring between two parents. And those are used to predict a particular trait. You would do one Punnett square for each trait that you're wishing to predict. And if you did your the rabbit lab in Discovery Ed, you'll know that you are trying to predict the outcome of rabbits having being more furry or having longer ears. And they use that for situations where if you wanted to make an animal that's more desirable in some way. In the case of the lab that you did, the pet store was selling more rabbits with longer ears, I believe, and they were trying to make more money. So they were finding parents and breeding the rabbits that only had that particular desirable trait. And that's the way we would use Punnett squares. We would find two parents, and we would find the traits that we would consider desirable, and we would put those two animals together and hope that they would produce offspring. And then we would use a Punnett square to determine or to predict the likelihood that that particular offspring is going to have the trait that we want it to have. If you'll think back to our probability in math, you know that in a Punnett square, there are 4 possible outcomes, sometimes depending on the mother and the father, the traits of each of the parents. So at the next slide, we'll look a little bit more at Punnett squares, but if you have any questions about Punnett squares, go and review the video on Punnett squares and then the paperwork that you had done when we made those crosses. Okay, so Punnett squares were developed by an English geneticist named Reginald Punnett, and he had done some genetic work with chickens. He was trying to see if he could predict the color of the offspring of particular chickens, and so he worked with the colors of their feathers, and then he just kind of looked at traits of the mother, traits of the father, and then he crossed different types of chickens in different colors, and that's how he came up with his tool that we use to make the predictions of the offspring. Gregor Mendel, if you remember, Gregor Mendel was a monk that did a lot of work with pea plants and with different flowers, you know, determining whether the offspring were going to be tall or short pea plants, or some of the flowers I think that we studied about whether they would have purple flowers or white flowers. And so the Punnett squares help us to predict the genotype and the phenotype of an offspring. So we need to review those vocabulary. Genotype meaning what are the genes, whether it's the alleles that are expressed. Remember the big A, little a, or the big B, little b, that would be their genotype. And then phenotype is what does it physically look like. So what is represented by the big A or the little a, and then what it would look like as a result. So genotype is what do the genes look like. Phenotype is what does the organism actually look like. The phenotype is what we can physically see. The crosses that we have done, when we talk about crosses, when we talk about Punnett squares, we are crossing two parents, and we're looking at the prediction of the likelihood that one offspring would exhibit the traits that we are looking at. And we call that a monohybrid cross. Okay, so if you were to break this word down, remember mono means one. Whoops, sorry, didn't mean to switch pages. But mono means one, and hybrid means like a mixture, like bring it together, or a cross. In those crosses, we are looking at a dominant and recessive trait. The dominant trait is always represented by the capital letter, and the recessive allele is the lowercase letter. And so those are the ones that, those alleles we call them, the big A, the little a, represent genes or traits that are passed from one generation to the next. Gene is just the code. It's like the genetic code for a trait, and a trait is what we can physically see. So take a look back. If some of this vocabulary is a little bit confusing, take a look back at that Quizlet list and review the vocabulary for this unit. And here's what a Punnett square would look like. I need to move me out of the way. There it is. And like I said, a Punnett square is where we would use it to predict one particular trait at a time from two parents. So in this case, we're looking at the father being a heterozygous. Let's see, this would be for tail color. So he's heterozygous for a white tail, and the mother is heterozygous also for a white tail. And this is referring back to the rabbits. This is brought out from a rabbit scenario. And we would be predicting what is the likelihood that the offspring would have either a white or a brown tail. So when we look at this, we can tell that there is a 25% chance that the offspring is homozygous dominant. That means that it is definitely going to have a white tail. There is a 25% chance that the offspring will be homozygous recessive. That means it's going to have a brown tail. And then there's a 50% chance, because these two heterozygous genes, there's a 50% chance that it will be heterozygous. And since the big T represents the dominant trait, which is white, then these two would also have white tails. So we would talk about that and say that the genotype, the possible genotypes, is 25% homozygous dominant, 25% homozygous recessive, and 50% heterozygous. That's for genotype. But for phenotype, we would say that there is a 75% chance of the offspring having a white tail and a 25% chance of it having a brown tail. Now, if we think back to math, we would say that it's more likely that the offspring of these two parents is going to have a white tail because there's a 75% chance it'll have a white tail and only a 25% chance it will have a brown tail. Now, remember, just because it's 25%, and unlikely doesn't mean that it's impossible. So it could have, it is possible that the offspring would have a brown tail. Okay. Now, let's talk about selective breeding. Using a Punnett square, we can determine the probability of the outcome of an offspring, but we can't guarantee it all the time because unless you know exactly what the parents' genotypes are, and you would have to do several generations of research to cross those and to know exactly what you're going to get as a result of breeding those two parents. And that actually happens. One of probably the most common scenarios where this happens is breeding dogs. Okay, different breeds of dogs. They do this sort of thing all the time where they have a particular trait that they want to see come out in a dog. And so they will find parents that they know that the offspring are going to be the desired result. Now, an example of that, and I think we've talked about it a little bit, is a Labradoodle. A Labradoodle is a cross between a Labrador Retriever and a Poodle. Poodles are hypoallergenic. They don't shed and they don't have dander. So people with allergies desire poodles. But sometimes maybe the characteristics of a poodle or the temperament of a poodle is not very good for people who have families. So what breeders did was they found dogs that were good for families, which is a Labrador Retriever. They're very loyal and they're very I guess they're not aggressive and they are easy to train. So they took a Labrador Retriever and they took a Poodle and they bred those two breeds of dogs, and the result was something called the Labradoodle. You have the hypoallergenic properties of the Poodle, and you've got the loyalty and the trainability of a Lab. And now those are, very common. Those are a very common breed of dog. That wasn't something natural. That was something that breeders decided that they were going to do, and do that with those two breeds of dogs. Now, one thing that you need to keep in mind, and something that you'll talk about in the 8th grade, is in order to crossbreed animals, it's got to be done within the same species. You can't crossbreed like a Jekyll, which is a kind of canine sort of dog, but they're not exactly like a domestic dog. So you can't breed like a Jekyll or like a hyena, kind of that kind of thing, and a dog. You can't breed those because they're not of the same species. If you were to be able to successfully do something like that, say like in the case of a liger, where you've bred a lion and a tiger, if you are able to successfully breed those two, then the result is going to be an offspring that is sterile. So you won't be able to do it and have it pass on generation to generation to generation. It would just be something that you would have one particular instance, and it would never be able to breed with another animal. Okay, that is also the case with mules. A mule is the offspring, the result of a horse and a donkey, and so mules cannot breed together and make more mules. It just doesn't work like that, and that's because they are not of the same species. They may be able to produce one offspring, but it can't sustain it. It can't continue to breed over and over and produce lots of offspring to create like a whole new species. It doesn't happen. So a lot of times, I've got some examples here where there are cases where you get those desirable traits, but there are also other problems with crossbreeding animals. Sometimes you can breed animals, and what the result is not exactly what you expected. So it may pass on undesirable traits in some way, and sometimes breeders will kind of breed animals so much, like they try to keep them in the same bloodline, and they have something called inbreeding. And inbreeding typically causes a lot of problems because some of the traits that may not be expressed, some of the recessive traits that aren't necessarily present with one set of parents, they may become present on down the line. And so it's actually frowned upon, and I think maybe illegal to inbreed animals such as dogs and things like that. Sometimes puppy mills are guilty of breeding like a mother dog with the son dog, and the puppies and things that it has, just because they want to be able to have a purebred animal. And sometimes buying purebred dogs is not always a good thing. You need to really do your research about how those animals are bred. So when you're watching, or when you have this link, I'm going to put the link in your pathway for this slideshow, and you click the little, this is called a chug. This is a cross between a Chihuahua and a Pug. It'll take you to an article, and it talks about how humans have actually caused some, in this case, painful mutations, or caused some mutations in dogs over the years. And real quick, I'll scroll through and show you that in the 1800s, this is what bull terriers look like. And if you don't know what a bull terrier looks like, you'll probably recognize it as I scroll down. But take a look at this. This is what a bull terrier looked like in the 1800s. And people will breed dogs to, for this case, they were fighting dogs. It wasn't illegal back then, but they bred them, and they would breed the ones that were stronger or had better muscle tone, or maybe weighed more, and was able to fight better. So the ones that lived, they would rebreed those over and over until they got the desired result, and they got dogs that would win in the dog fights. Nowadays, This is what a bull terrier looks like. This would be a purebred bull terrier. And that's what he looks like now. So see the difference? And this is their very distinctive, that kind of rounded forehead and nose. That's what we look for, what people look for, breeders look for now. And notice back in the 1800s, it did not have that. Okay. And here's Basset Hounds. Now I have a Basset Hound, and he is that very typical looking Basset Hound. This is one back in the 1800s. This is what Basset Hounds looked like back then. Now, some of you may say, oh, well, that kind of looks like Basset Hounds, but Basset Hounds have changed a lot. And Basset Hounds are now the result of people breeding the dogs when the offspring would have the longer ears and the shorter legs. You know, Basset Hounds nowadays have very, very short back legs. And a lot of those problems as they're being bred, some I have seen have something called a roach back. And because of the result of their shorter legs, it causes the back of their, or the back, this part right here, to kind of have a little hump in it. They call that a roach back. But here is what my Basset Hound looks like. This isn't my Basset Hound, but my Rocky looks just like this. He's black and white. He's got these big, giant ears. And you'll notice that Basset Hounds in the 1800s didn't have those big, droopy cheeks, those big, droopy jaws. They weren't there. And so nowadays, when you're looking at purebred dogs, and if you're watching dog shows, those are the things that people are looking for. They're looking for those particular traits, that saggy skin and those little tiny short legs with big old lumps of skin on them. And so that's kind of what they look like. Let's look at boxers. You guys may know what boxers look like. This is what boxers look like. That looks more like a pit bull. A boxer is a type of bulldog, and it actually used to look a lot more like a pit bull than what they do today. And let's see, this is what boxers typically look like today. Notice they have that shorter snout. Now, the tail is usually cropped off when they're puppies. So boxers are born with tails. That's not something that genetically they're born without tails. That doesn't happen. You actually have to cut those off. They didn't used to do them quite so close, I guess. But you can see the difference, like in the ears and in the nose. This is what a purebred, or what the desirable boxer would look like nowadays. And notice how much it's changed. Dachshunds. Here was a Dachshund back in the 1800s. Doesn't look a whole lot different, really. Notice their back legs, though. I think probably the ears and the back legs probably have been the biggest change. And the longer neck. See the difference in the way that they stand. And if you watch dog shows, that's one thing that they're looking for, is the way that they hold their head and the way that they look when they're standing still. They look for that straight back and those kind of things. And those are all traits that have been bred into them. Now, German Shepherds. I was glad to see German Shepherds really haven't changed a whole lot. German Shepherds were originally bred to herd cattle or sheep. And you'll know that nowadays they're used a lot on police forces. They have a really good nose and a really high drive. So they use them in searching out bombs and drugs and people. And they haven't really changed a lot, other than their body size has gotten larger. Okay. And then pugs. They really haven't changed a lot either. They were ugly back in the 1800s, and they're still ugly today. I'm just kidding. They're cute. They got a little squished up face and that little curly tail. They haven't changed a lot. Maybe their body size has got a little bit different. Let's see. Then St. Bernards. If you've ever watched a lot of cartoons, a lot of times St. Bernards were bred to be rescue dogs. They are good at, they are also good at hunting. They can find certain things. They are used sometimes in in earthquakes and things like that to find people. Or avalanches. A lot of times they'll use them whenever there's been an avalanche, and they will use them to find people if they believe that people have been buried in the avalanches. They are nice big dogs. Then we have the English Bulldog. Hasn't really changed a lot. The eyes and their body stance has changed a little. The wrinkles, they're all cute. And that's all of them. So those are some ways that humans have changed the way that breeds of dogs look over the years. Some people frown on that. Um, there are a lot of animal rights groups that are particularly speak out against puppy mills or breeding for purebred animals, and they just kind of try to discourage people from trying to seek out and buy purebred animals. Now, on the other hand, selective breeding is not it's not just for animals. We can do that with plants. And a couple of examples that I've got listed here. This is one that my husband had brought up that farmers have been doing for a few hundred years, a couple of hundred years. It says late in the 19th century, Scotland and Germany, farmers were crossbreeding a type of wheat called, I think that's triticum and rye. So they crossbred those, and now they have something called triticale. I may not be pronouncing that right, but that would be something. It is a cross between two different types of like grass, wheatgrass or ryegrass, and I'm not really sure what all the uses would be. Probably, like a larger wheat and or rye production, and sometimes they use that to feed their animals. They use that to make bread, different things. But one I am pretty familiar with is something called golden rice. And golden rice was developed because in some third world countries, they were noticing that people were suffering from a disease called scurvy. And scurvy is a lack of vitamin C and a lack of like other vitamins and minerals. Like they were, it was causing blindness in children because of the lack of beta carotene and some other essential vitamins and minerals. So they developed something called golden rice. And this is a rice that's kind of orange in color. They were able to breed a rice that's high in beta carotene and high in vitamin C to try to help save these kids' lives of these children that were growing up in the really poor countries, to where the only crop that they really could grow would be rice. And if you know anything about rice is pretty bland, and it's not terribly high in vitamins and minerals. So they figured out a way to help that, and they were able to teach these people how to grow it. If you open up the notes here, you can click on this article, and it opens up the article about golden rice. And we're not going to go over that right now, but that's a useful way. That is a way that they've used the technology and they use the know-how to pretty much save lives. I want to also point out that crossbreeding plants to get a particular outcome is not new. It's been around since ancient Egyptians. And the most common one is corn. Corn originally, and in its kind of before it was tampered with, was nothing more than grass. It was a grass plant, and what happened over I don't know, probably hundreds of years, they would take the tallest plants and the ones with the largest seed pod, which is the corn cob, the corn stalk. They would crossbreed those and grow those and use those seeds, and they would just crossbreed them and use only the largest seeds each time until they finally got it to where you now have the large corn cob with lots of kernels on it, with lots of seed kernels, and we eat it as corn on the cob or maybe canned corn. But we definitely eat a lot of corn. But corn was never meant to be eaten that way. The way that it originally was. It just kind of works out that it tastes delicious and we all love it. And it's a staple for lots of other things that we eat, like cereal and bread or tortillas, chips, lots of different corn products. Not only that, but you could also use like other products like paper, plastics. Lots of things come from corn. We're not going to get into that. That's a lot of stuff that you learn in the 8th grade. But just FYI, some of the controversy for GMOs are those things that people are messing with nature, and they're making things that are artificial and not the way nature intended. But I think that probably if you were to do the research, you would be very hard pressed to find anything that's not been crossbred in some way. Some of the controversial ones, and you'll talk about this, of course, more in the 8th grade, are things like GMOs that are the Roundup Ready corn, so that it's protected against Roundup, a weed killer. There are Flavor Saver tomatoes. There's lots of instances where that's the case as far as food and GMOs. And I'm not going to steal Mr. Woody's thunder, so I just hope you stay curious and you can ask him lots of questions. Now we'll talk about pedigrees just a little bit and what the difference between a pedigree and a Punnett square is. A pedigree is a chart that shows the occurrence of a phenotype. This would be kind of after the fact. This isn't used to predict the outcome. This is used to kind of look at past generations and where the traits have shown up in the past. I'll refer back to dogs again, because you think about when you buy a purebred dog, a lot of times they want to see a pedigree chart, and that will show the traits and the mother and the father. And if you're looking at this, it'll also prove whether or not they have been inbred. So as long as they're not being crossed with the brothers and the sisters or the mothers and the fathers of that they are actually, completely unrelated animals that are being crossed together and making the puppy or the new dog. The royal family is one that I just discussed with my husband and I were talking about. And I once was watching a video on pedigrees and talked about that in the past, the royal family. This was something that was very important to the royal family. That's part of the reason that they don't marry outside of their family. A lot of royalty would marry like their first cousin or second cousin. So it was I think kind of frowned upon today. I don't think that it happens as much as it used to, but they used to try to marry only their cousins because they tried to keep the royal family intact somewhat. And here is a case where that is not always a good thing. So if you were to have, this shows the passage of hemophilia, and a hemophilia is the absence of a clotting agent in your blood. So they call people who have hemophilia free bleeders. So if you even were to get like a minor cut, some people with hemophilia could bleed to death because their blood won't clot, and they'll just continue to bleed and bleed and bleed until it becomes a major issue. But in this case, it shows how hemophilia is passed from one generation to the next. And this one came from a website there where it was talking about the royal family. I'm not sure that it was the British royal family, but a royal family. And one of the characteristics was hemophilia. Well, it became prevalent in all of the offspring within that family. And I guess, it's an undesirable trait. It's not something that you want passed from one generation to the next. But because of the intermarriage or interfamily marriages and having children, that's one trait that was common to that royal family. Another pedigree chart, a reason that we would do that or people use these are for racehorses. And we'll look at one of my questions that I have for you are talking about racehorses. I actually watched a racehorse auction, and it blew my mind that some of these racehorses were $10 million or more. And so when people are buying racehorses and they're paying $10 million, they want to know who their parents are. They want to know if they come from a bloodline of race winners, or, how far back does it go that they have been champion racehorses. They want to know how many generations back does it go. And they pay a lot of money for that. So that brings us to this. Things that I want you to investigate before the next time we get together are, why would a racehorse cost more than an airplane? And I just gave you a little bit of that. That's not the whole reason. It's not just because they win races, but there are other reasons. But why would a racehorse cost more than an airplane? That kind of blows my mind. Next question is, can all species of animals crossbreed? And my question is, if that's true, if all species can crossbreed, what about fish? And what about birds? Do we have lots of different breeds of fish and birds? And then what might be some of the benefits and disadvantages of, of artificial selection? I would say maybe try to list 3 benefits and 3 disadvantages of artificial selection. Give some specific examples. And then last, what is the most expensive breed of dog and what is it used for? Almost all dogs have a purpose of some sort, whether that be like herding or hunting or protection or companionship. But what is the most expensive breed of dog and what is it used for? Or why are they bred? So hopefully this kind of piques your curiosity a little bit to go and investigate these things just a little bit more. And feel free to contact me if you have any questions regarding anything that we went over today. Enjoy your weekend.